All right.
90s court.
Oh.
Was that me?
That.
Because there was a lot of the people were in Milton together. Oh, okay. And I was not, I came to later in their life, but.
All right. Hey, thank you guys for being here tonight. I'm going to use the microphone just so everyone online can hear me, but I'm Rabbi Hilly Haber. Thank you for joining us online and also in person. I'm with Professor Josh Dubler. Campus songster Gani will be joining us soon. But we're going to get started. I'm so excited for this conversation. I think it speaks to the themes of the month of Elul, a time of introspection and self-reflection, preparation for the high holidays, and getting us thinking about teshuvah, atonement, repentance, and return. And tonight, already here, we have one expert in restorative justice practices and thinking about abolition and new ways to imagine our carceral system, and we'll be joined by another expert soon as well. Gani will be joining us, but I'm so grateful to you for being here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Hilly. Thank you, Rabbi Hilly. My microphone is now on. Thanks to you, and thanks to Rabbi Angela and Rachel and Julia and the folks behind the scenes. We're waiting on Gani to come, but we'll try to backfill the conversation once he arrives. And thank you all for coming. And
maybe grab the other one. There's one more.
Thank you all for coming, for those of you who are watching at home. So my name is Joshua Dubler, and I am a professor of religion at the University of Rochester, where I also direct the Rochester Education Justice Initiative. And we operate degree programs in a number of prisons, including Attica, where we're looking to launch a BA this year, and we support formerly incarcerated students and formerly incarcerated people in other ways, and we try to educate the community and try to mobilize resources toward decarceration in the city and in the state. University of Rochester is the 5th largest employer in the state, so it's a big fish up in that corner. I think we have a lot to contribute to those efforts. And that's the primary reason that I'm here, is I'm really looking to build those bridges with this community toward those efforts. I brought some literature that you'll find on the table about our work. Please take it and consider supporting us. And if you're at home, just Google us. It's the Rochester Education Justice Initiative. So this Elul, I've been thinking about my friends who aren't afforded the opportunity to atone. My friends like Stan Rosenthal and Charles Coley, who I know as Mubdi, people that Gani also knows. These are two of the very best, most ethically serious people I've ever met. I know Stan and Mubdi from Pennsylvania's Graterford Prison. Both men are serving life in prison. And in Pennsylvania, people sentenced to life aren't parole eligible. So increasingly, organizers try to talk about LWOP, life without the possibility of parole, as death by incarceration. Because that's what it is. That's also the sentence that Gani was sentenced to, although he was released after Miller v. Alabama as a juvenile lifer. Things have been getting better on this front, but with 2 of its 5 members seeking statewide office, outcomes this year have been grim, right? So both John Fetterman and Josh Shapiro are on the commutation board. And they're not looking to open up any kind of political exposure around these issues. And so both Stan and Mubdi have had hearings this year and have been shot down. Similar dynamics take place in New York State with parole, people going up for parole every couple of years and getting shot down. And here too in New York, things seem to be trending in a good direction, but still a very difficult process. It's a classic catch-22. When my friends go before the commutation board, members of the board demand that they take responsibility for what they have done. But when they try to take responsibility, the facts of the crimes for which they have been convicted, which in the case of each is homicide, negates their confessions and invalidates their decades of good works. They are left to infer, and I say infer because the board owes petitioners no formal explanation of their decision. They're left to infer that their crime is simply too great to be forgiven. Stan has been in prison since the 1980s. Mubdi has been in prison longer than I've been alive, and I was born in 1974. People sentenced to death by incarceration are an extreme instance of what I think is a generalizable rule. The machinery of American state violence is extraordinarily efficient and effective. Its imprint brutal and lasting. As Americans, we are conditioned to imagine that a criminal, right, a criminal, is not merely a person who is responsible for a particular harm. Rather, a criminal is a being who is fundamentally and comprehensively defined for the crime for which they have been convicted. Right? I mean, with a murderer being paradigmatic. But I think it's a general rule. So a criminal is defined for the crime that they've been convicted, or in the case of most people currently being warehoused on Rikers Island, where someone else died yesterday, not convicted of anything, right? Most people at Rikers have not been convicted of any crime. For too many Americans, and this is when I say that the system is efficient and effective, for too many Americans, the mere fact that a person has been arrested for a crime is characterological proof enough that a cage is where they rightfully belong. That is to say, all that is required for a cage to be the right place for you is that the police have put you there. Not true of me, not true of others in this room, perhaps. Right? That wouldn't happen to us, but it happens to lots of people. There's deep-seated anti-blackness at work in such violent sorting, and more than a little Calvinist theology. 200 years ago, up in my neck of the woods, those who developed the Auburn prison discipline leaned on the book of Isaiah to make this argument. As per Isaiah 48:10, like the children of Israel exiled to Babylon, men incarcerated at Auburn prison were to be refined in the furnace of affliction. Here's the logic, right? That is to say, for those who come to be administered in our machinery of state violence, suffering is not merely justified, it's said to be edifying. And the Auburn discipline of single cells, shop floor labor, and physical punishment would more or less become the prototype for all modern prisons thereafter. Psychological researchers draw a distinction between guilt and shame. Shame and guilt are both self-conscious moral emotions. Guilt involves a articulated condemnation of a specific behavior. I did something wrong. I hurt you. Shame involves a global negative evaluation of the self. I am a bad person. The thing that I've done makes me evidences that I'm a bad person. Guilt in this formula, in this framework, is a healthy emotion. Shame is an unhealthy emotion. Where one is guilty, that is, where one sees oneself as responsible for a harm, that harm may potentially be rectified with apology, with atonement, with tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah. Shaming, where one's character is fundamentally defined by one's trespass, affords no comparable path to atonement, to reconciliation, and therefore actually impedes the taking of responsibility. Right? If the fact of this crime makes me human garbage, then I'm not incentivized to take responsibility for that crime. This is what I have in mind when I say that my incarcerated friends in Pennsylvania aren't allowed to atone. Sure, they are coaxed to make confessions, but the confessions that they make are treated only as evidence in a criminological sense, not as an action that might be part of repair and reconciliation. We abolitionists try to flip the script. We abolitionists speak not of criminals, but of processes of criminalization. As abolitionists understand it, those acts of interpersonal harm that constitute crimes do not, as a rule, take place in a vacuum. People make choices, and to varying degrees, people are morally responsible for their actions. Overwhelmingly, however, those responsible for criminal harms are downstream of socially engineered circumstances of subjection and neglect, of racialized poverty, of underfunded schools, of neighborhoods that are short on the sorts of social infrastructure that can engender health and well-being, and long on police surveillance. It is all this messy stuff, and not merely a sui generis criminal, that results in the sorts of trespasses and harms that people on TV call crime. Indeed, the widespread practices of exile and stigmatizing those who come to be criminalized, that is to say, those we come to see as criminals, is itself a contributing factor to the social production of further harms, harms in no way limited to the subset of harms we call crimes, right? And you could think of things like broken families and so on. It may be some measure of progress, I think, that the abolitionist picture I've just painted probably comes to few of you as much of a surprise. It goes without saying, I think, that none of us in this room, watching from home, whether we live in New York or Rochester, in the city or in the burbs or elsewhere, exists somehow outside the complex of messy social processes I've just sketched out. Therefore, should we elect to trade talk of criminals for processes of criminalization, one might reasonably suggest that we are all complicit in such a system. And it's true. However, I am uneasy with confessions of complicity, lest it encourage us to stop at confession. Like Hannah Arendt says, where all are guilty, none is guilty. Let us collectively resist the temptation to universalize our responsibility to the point that we are absolved from the obligation to have to make things right. Put more glibly, let us not stop at feeling good about feeling bad. On this beautiful Elul evening, let us rather think together about what atonement might look like within such a circumstance, right? Toward this end, I was thrilled when Ghani agreed to come have this conversation with us. And we're in something of a messianic space, but he will arrive, I promise. I don't know anyone who thinks the project and practices of restoration, redemption, and abolition more originally and planetarily than Ghani does, and always with an eye toward what can and what must be done locally. As we will discuss, abolition is way more than about prisons and law enforcement. As Ghani will talk about, it's about figuring out a way to build power to keep the planet inhabitable. It's about how we conceptualize harm and engender accountability, about how we might work together to shrink systems of state violence and nurture alternatives where the safety and well-being of my children isn't pitted in a zero-sum game against the safety and well-being of someone else's children. And I was going to skip this if Ghani was here, but since he isn't, I'll run this bit. And by we, I really mean all of us. The incarcerated and formerly incarcerated may be our culture's scapegoats, but reciprocally, we somehow also have a habit of turning them into saints, as if by means of their redemption, we too might come to be redeemed. But let's not let ourselves off that easy. As I cautioned Ghani the last time he came here, please be careful not to leave the good folks at Central with the mistaken impression that somehow you're the only one who needs to make tshuva. And I would group myself with the good folks at Central in that equation. It's not just the incarcerated and the formerly incarcerated who need to make tshuva. There is so much work to be done. My hope for myself and for you is that in the weeks ahead, the High Holiday liturgy might furnish us with fuel for moral creativity, deepening collectivity, and resolve. Let us take the implications seriously when we recite in morning prayers that ours is a God that matir asurim, frees the prisoners. And if, like me, you don't make it to shul that early, you can always look back in the book. It's still there. When we recite the vidui, let us flirt with the possible, more than flirt. Let us take seriously, let us try to embody the possible social implications of a world where confessions are primarily made in the first person plural. In our courts and in our prisons, we objectify and we exile the guilty few. In the vidui, by contrast, we affirm trespass and responsibility for harms for which things that we are all on the hook together for. As we discussed in my class last week, abolitionist Mariam Kaba says everything that is worthwhile is done with other people. In the weeks ahead, then, may the vidui constitute us not as individuals seeking resolve individually, individuals seeking forgiveness individually, but rather as members of a collective capable of committing itself to doing good, to making good together. Finally, there is the Yom Kippur Haftorah, and this is from which I'm an author of a book with my colleague Vincent Lloyd that takes its title from this. Like the furnace of affliction that the prison administrators up in Auburn used to justify the infliction of suffering on incarcerated people, the Yom Kippur Haftorah is also drawn from Isaiah. But as with the vidui, it manifests an unambivalently abolitionist spirit. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, Isaiah writes? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? V'chol motah tanakkehu, and break every yoke. The passage was a common refrain among abolitionists in the 19th century. William Lloyd Garrison would sign his letters with the phrase. Just as 19th century abolitionists drew moral clarity from Scripture, my hope for us is that Jewish communities in the 21st century might draw clarity from liturgy and Scripture and one another to contribute to struggles for justice and survival. I know that many watching from home and Zoom are actively involved in this work with Central Synagogue's criminal justice reform and reentry initiatives, working with Our Children, the Reentry Theater of Harlem, and other vital initiatives, and working in coalition with others to push for meaningful decarceral change in Albany, for social policies that move us away from cages and toward collective care. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you. I look forward to the conversation ahead, and I hope that it may serve as a launching pad for ongoing collaborations.
Amen. It's beautiful. Is it okay if we open up for questions?
Sure. You want to have a question, or you want to?
We'll start
Okay.
here. Yeah. Or comments? I can start. Yeah. I had a few things that that was so beautifully spoken and written. So much going on. I guess, can you talk more about complicity? Thinking about, I love how you said that, like, collective complicity and thinking if all are guilty, then no one's guilty. How is that kind of reimagined when we're thinking about restorative justice and taking responsibility for structural injustice?
I mean, my hope is that we can save restorative justice and transformative justice for when Ghani gets here. I mean, Ghani engineered a project called Ubuntu Philadelphia, Ubuntu from this notion, I am because we are. When, at the time after Miller v. Alabama, when he was coming home and he recognized that, okay, so we were coming home, but is the community ready for us to come home? And so he staged a series of reconciliation rituals with folks who had been responsible for grievous harm and for folks who've been victimized by harm. So let's save that for when Ghani gets here. I mean, I guess what I was trying to articulate, I was trying to kind of navigate two potential traps that I don't want to fall into, right? So on the one hand, it is about processes of criminalization, not about sui generis criminals. So I don't think any of us is free to stand idly by as if we're somehow not part of these systems that result in certain members of the community to be who are already vulnerable to be further brutalized, right? I think like we're responsible. The danger with overgeneralizing it, right, to the point of truism is that you run the risk of what Arendt is trying to argue against, right? That it's too easy to say, oh yes, we're all complicit, right? I feel similarly about confessions about privilege. Okay, we're privileged, we can declare our privilege, and right? So it seems like the task for us in the month ahead is about, and I guess this is like a mirror image in a way about my friends who confess, but it's only treated as criminological. What is confession, right? What is confession? Okay, let's confess. But then is confession, is that a pressure release valve? Do we confess? We leave in the afternoon of Yom Kippur and we're like, okay, I'm hoping in the right book, and then you wait and you start confessing again another 320 days later? Or, as I hope it would be, right, in the model I'm laying out with this kind of like the first person plural of the vidui, can we, in our confession for our participation in ongoing systems of domination, can we build collectivities and resolve ourselves to be part of collectives that aren't going to cash out on the 11th of Tishrei? Right, like I won't go to shul as much after the 11th of Tishrei, it's true. But can we, and I'm like trying to psych myself up here as much as I'm trying to psych up all of you, can we really try to enact what that collective confession looks like when the thing we're confessing is our participation in these systems of domination, and think about what ongoing atonement for that would be?
I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more for you what it means to be an abolitionist today?
Sure. I think about being an abolitionist, and I think about being Jewish, and I really want. I'm glad to be here. I'm privileged to be here to try to do my part to allow this. I think the spirit of abolition move through the Jewish community. I think it's really important that the Jewish community takes this on. Maybe the Jewish community is too much of an abstraction, but it takes this on. Abolitionism is a lot of things. It's a vibrant heart of a social movement at this moment in history, right? Abolitionism is a horizon, right? It's positing the idea that, okay, someday, like all social institutions, the prison will pass. What comes next, right? Abolitionism, like the temporality of abolitionism, is this kind of fierce now, this refusal. No, the systems that we have are not acceptable. And at the same time, what I see from abolitionists is a kind of awareness that this struggle is a generational one, and it'll be around, and it won't be one until long after we're gone. So I mean, abolitionism is a movement, it's a mood, it's a spirit. But I would say more practically, if that's the question, is more practically, it seems like if you look on the ground in various places, including New York City, the people who are doing prison abolitionist work are looking to push to shrink the systems of state violence, right? I mean, so this has been in the push to close Rikers, right? This has been, there are those who think that, let's say, reformists, who think that the solution to Rikers is to build better new prisons, and the abolitionist stance is, no, let's have fewer people in cages. Right? So abolitionists push to shrink the footprints of state violence and want to invest in alternative ways of trying to pursue and ensure well-being and public safety. And that's done sometimes through agitating within the state. I mean, this is really with a supermajority in both in Albany, there, whether it be bail reform or whether it be solitary confinement reform, there have been real ways to push the state. But a lot of abolitionists also are working in the realm of mutual aid and collective care, right? The state is what it is. It's not gonna save us. So, so I would say that we did this class, and this is what the first class focused on. A way of understanding a kind of the abolitionist reformist split, right? Abolitionists. To be an abolitionist is not necessarily to say all prisons should be closed tomorrow and there should be no one in cages. It's not necessarily to say that. It's to say, okay, we're going to have reforms. We're going to reform the system. Do we want to have reforms of the system that absorbs the critique of the current system in order to allow the system to grow? Which is to say, do we want to have fewer people in prison but have more people under house arrest? Do we want to have fewer people executed but more people serving the sentence of life without the possibility of parole? Or, when we're pushing for structural reforms, do we want to push for reforms that are going to shrink the footprint of the entire apparatus of state violence? So I would welcome you, like in a kind of in a solicitous vein, I would say identity is not important, but I would think if you are working to shrink the footprint of policing and prisons in your community, then I believe that you're part of an abolitionist project.
You gave kind of I would say like a theological anthropology of what it means to be human. We can define that different ways. So I'd start with high holidays. Like what is the anthropology of our high holidays? How does Judaism define our humanity? And thinking about Teshuvah, I think we are capable of evolution, that we change over time, that we all commit certain harms to certain degrees, that we're capable of recognizing that and making amends for that. I think that's one kind of strong way that we consider what it means to be human through these holidays, and that we do that together, that is a communal event, and it can't happen in a vacuum, it happens in relationship. And I'm wondering, I think that mirrors in a lot of ways the anthropology of abolition, of what it means to be human, of what the potential there. And I think I loved how you contrasted that in your description of the carceral system, of the way that what it means to be human in that system is so counter to the ways that we act and live out through the high holidays. And I would say that we kind of have an abolitionist practice, that our ways of collective and individual atonement, and I think working with God's mercy in public is an abolitionist posture that we all take on as a community in this moment, in this month, and leading up to the high holidays. What's your take on that?
No, I love that. Is that a recent formulation for you?
Just now, thinking.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's. I mean, I think that would be the hope.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yeah. Yes.
I'm a little nervous about saying something in public, but maybe this is more of a comment. I'm very, very aware of how important it is to speak in a way that people can hear. And it seems with so much division, there's things that people will stop listening instantly because they can't hear it. Like defund the police is just one thing that comes up. And I think it's really important when using terms that can be so broad, or concepts like abolition, that we need to do what we started to do in your first class, which is really name all the intersections of what needs to change, where the education system, the treatment of mental health, the treatment of addiction, property taxes, all these things, because it's all intertwined. And we obviously aren't going to get to an abolitionist stage if we take care of all the problems of the disease and not the symptoms. And so I think it's really important that we start talking in really specific terms about this broader concept. Otherwise, I think we're just losing people in the idea of how do you practically now make amends? What do you do? So, as I mentioned, one of my practical ways is my interest is very much in substance abuse and recovery from substance abuse, and how many people that has, the criminalization of that, of addiction. And so I hope we can talk in much more practical terms, but in the intersection of how many different pieces there are.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot, right? I think the question, and one of the things that we read in that class was that article, What Abolitionists Do, right? And I think that's really the question. What are we doing in our own communities? And that could be we're part of, that could be that we're part of a coalition that's pushing for changes in Albany. That could be we're part of an institution that historically hasn't made any space for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, and we're working to make space for formerly incarcerated and incarcerated people. But yeah, I mean, I'm attracted. Like, I like the fire of abolition, right? I think it's the kind of fuel for social movement. I think we need social movements to save us, and I feel like tepid, pragmatic type rhetoric is not what fuels social movements. I feel like the civil rights movement and the movement that abolished slavery are these grand moral movements. So I think there's a real place for it. But simultaneously, absolutely point taken, right? I feel like the argument, ultimately, the test for abolitionism is practical and at the margin, right? So the distinction we talked about in class was reformist versus non-reformist reforms, right? Are we pushing for reforms that are going to grow the system, as has been the case during the entire duration of mass incarceration? Or are we going to push for reforms that shrink the system? And I think that that's generally a good place to see where the abolitionist is standing.
Maybe we can talk a little about theologies of suffering and kind of how those play out in the carceral system. And I think too important, especially having a conversation like this in a house of worship, is kind of the theological underpinnings of the American carceral system and what that looks like. And I think that, for me, is a place of atonement and amends, that as people of faith in this country, that communities of faith have played a role in imagining punishment, imagining suffering as its own merit, imagining that that there are people who can't be saved, and those all are theological concepts at work in our cages, in the cages, in prisons. So how does that kind of play into your religious identity, your Jewish identity as a person of faith? That connection between theology and incarceration.
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer this question. I mean, I wouldn't know if I'd identify as a person of faith. I'm a person of some measure of Jewish practice. I mean, I'm a sociologist of religion at heart, right? And so, I mean, I think there's real power in religious faith, and there's real power in religious institutions. But it's also, it's the case that we're just in this weirdly religious country, right? That whatever this terrain is, if you're a citizen of this country, you're in a weirdly religious country. I mean, we could talk about Carl Schmitt and secularism and simply as theological concepts. We don't need to commit ourselves to that, right? It's just that when you're looking at the institutions of this country and the ideologies of this country, they are going to be religious. So the prison is the paradigmatic, right? This modern institution, and we think of it as this kind of modern bureaucratic machinery, but there it is, right, in the concept itself, the penitentiary, right? The penitentiary, it's a religious concept. And, you know, and this history has been written and rewritten over the last 50 years, but like the penitentiary comes from this kind of, this more benevolent kind of misguided but well-intentioned Philadelphia model. Right? This is the model of incarceration that you know, comes out of the Philadelphia Society for Eliminating Public Miseries, and you know, Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin. The Quaker conception, right, is that people commit crimes because they've like fallen in with the wrong crowd, basically. But, and this goes back to the question of a theological anthropology, because it's a Quaker conceptualization, like we all got a little bit of God in us. Right? We've got a little bit of God in us. And so the concept of the first penitentiary is, you know, let's take you out of this context that's making you debauched, and like your inner light can glow again, right? It was well-intentioned, but you know, but you can read when Charles Dickens visits Walnut Street, you know, in 1841, you can see, you know, it was an incredibly brutal procedure. But it also, it's somewhat beside the point because it proved totally unscalable, right? So it really is this kind of weird, this weird hodgepodge, like, you know, so abolitionists like to point out that like the prison has always been a failure. The prison is always being reformed. And it really is true that from its first iteration, it failed. So like they build a Newgate prison in New York City based on the Philadelphia model, and it's a disaster from the beginning. These Newgate recidivists, because they weren't beating the prisoners up. They weren't beating the prisoners up. Okay, so the Auburn model comes in, and it's this kind of like marriage of like pragmatics. Okay, how can we build a prison that's actually manageable? Okay, well, instead of working in their cells, they're going to work on shop floors. We're going to beat the hell out of them when we have to. And it's a marriage between this kind of administrative pragmatics and, again, like, oh, we're in this like weirdly religious country, like the Second Great Awakening happens. And as soon as there are people in cages, you know, these are people who've read the book of Acts, these are people who've read the book of Genesis. They're like, I want to get in on some of that. I want to get in on saving some of those souls, right? So as long as there have been people in cages in this country, there have been weird do-gooders like you and me who are like, oh, I want to go in there and I want to do some good. Like, we're a weird country, right? So that's always going to be the case in this country. I think, right, that like we're not going to do anything in this country that we do secularly is going to have weird religious undertones. I mean, I happen to think that, you know, I don't, maybe not to disavow responsibility, but largely American prisons in the 19th century, at least, Christian problem, you know. But then the question is, okay, but what about us? What about us? Right? I mean, so yeah, it's a nasty Calvinist theology that is willing to discard people and is willing to call their torture their salvation. It's nasty, but it's nothing that American Jews can't easily accommodate themselves to, right? And like this is the nature of what those of us who majored in social studies at Harvard called hegemony. I did not go to Harvard. Is that you come to be accommodated, right? So by the time you wake up and you look around, okay, you're in communities that like avow anti-blackness and avow this kind of Calvinist theology, right? That's by the time you poke your nose around, that's how it is, right? That is the contract of whiteness, and in aggregate, American Jews have embraced that contract. Okay, so here we are. But then we have the opportunity of the 21st century and Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and all sorts of enthusiasms and agitations. And then the question is, okay, so what do we do now? What do we do now? Right? Like, I'm not here to tell you that, like, that I can't hold up the Tanakh and be like, it's an abolitionist document. No, it's like, it's a document that can be used for all sorts of things. And here we are living in this country that has these kinds of problems. We're a community of commitment that disproportionately has access to the levers of power. How do we draw on these traditions in order to try to, bend the arc of history?
Is that for Zoom, or can I just? For Zoom, yeah. Okay. So since you just mentioned the new Jim Crow, and since I appreciate your defense of like the fire of the power of the phrase abolitionism as opposed to a more incremental approach, I take it that part of sort of the Michelle Alexander critique, and part of what I suspect you believe, is that everything we're looking at now is in some way a legacy of slavery. And that, in fact, in some fundamental way, the abolitionist project was a formalist success and a functionalist failure. And I guess I wonder, in light of that, about reclaiming the name, sort of reclaiming the name without recognition of the possibility that sometimes the formalist success is a functionalist failure, especially in this area where power and privilege tend to morph and re-stratify themselves in new ways. I don't know. I wonder what you think about that.
Just imagine what life was like at their dinner table, these two.
It's a great question. It's a great question. I like to say, if I wasn't like a professional teacher on this stuff, like al regel achat, I was standing on one leg, like sure, it's like it's true enough. It's true enough, like slavery, segregation, mass incarceration. True, like that is a true enough story, 100%. Like, yeah, true enough. I have misgivings about it for a number of reasons, right? One, I don't think that in any way, I don't think in any way mass incarceration was foreordained. Hold it, I have two points and I have to like find them. I think it lends itself, for the reasons that you say, to the kind of too clean new Jim Crow narrative does lend itself, I think, to a kind of feeling good about feeling bad liberalism, right? Like, nothing changes. It's just so sad. Like so, and I think I think it can really discourage organizing, that kind of fatalism. It also, of course, masks the fact that white incarceration rates in the United States are 5 times that of incarceration rates in Germany and France, right? That even if you just had white people in prison in this country, you would have mass incarceration. So I tend to, it's hard. Like when I teach this stuff, we read Michelle Alexander and I do it and I try to problematize it, and then it's just like, it has a way of mowing everything else down, because the students come into class with that narrative and they know that narrative, and the narrative feels good in a way that things that feel bad but feel good feel. I tend to lean much more on, again, abolitionist thinkers, people like Loic Wacquan and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Jackie Wang, that really look at, in making sense of mass incarceration, definitely constitutive anti-blackness, constitutive settler coloniality, that long, deep grooves that it is the latest articulation of. But it's really a story of shifts in political economy in the 1970s, right? With redescriptions of the state, in the shift from the Keynesian state to Milton Friedman's state, right? Deindustrialization, surplus population, right? criminalization of urban poverty. Like read Jackie Wang's Carceral Capitalism, right? That there's, you know, it's not by accident that Black Lives Matter kicks off in Ferguson, Missouri, right? You know, that like there were 3 outstanding warrants for every family in Ferguson, Missouri. How does it come to be that there are 3 outstanding warrants? That, yeah, it's white supremacy, it's Missouri. But it's also about municipal budgets in the age of austerity and finance capital and bond ratings and having to balance municipal budgets with fines and fees, right? So I think it's much more contingent than the new Jim Crow story tells it, but I also think it's much deeper and more, that white supremacy is only one of those wells, right? There's also a lot that's embedded in our political economy. That needs, again, this is where an abolitionist, you know, I understand the, it's off-putting rhetoric, you know, I'm convinced that like abolitionists are the pragmatists in this framework. The people who think we can just build 4 new jails in New York and suddenly that's good, those are the idealists. Those are the dreamers. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, it's okay, we just have to change everything. Right? I do think that when we're looking at mass incarceration, we are looking at something that is a symptom of massive structures of inequality that relate to how we live and how we work and how we pay wages and how we pay for health care. It's a symptom of all these things. So you have to change all those things. Now, that is a little discouraging. But I like to say on this that like, you know, it's like if we're only talking about ecological stuff, like it's either abolition grade change or it's the end. So we're going to have to make abolition grade change. And maybe as your point, Ariella, right, maybe by abolition grade change, like it's not nearly enough, right? It may be the kind of abolition grade changes that we'll be able to do around the environment will be formalist changes that are insufficient. But it's still like, if you're looking for a model in the country's history, if you're looking to be inspired by narratives, where else are you going to look?
I think one thing too I mean, I love New Jim Crow, and I think it put the conversation of mass incarceration on the main stage in our country. And I also think that, like, to have a linear narrative from slavery to mass incarceration, also, I mean, I think we lose the stories of abolitionists who were organizing for freedom during slavery, of Black abolitionists who were putting together movements of freedom, who were ministers and doctors and putting together freedom schools in New York. And just, I think those kinds of individual and also movement-based and communal-based pushes for abolition get lost in that linear narrative. So I'm wondering, what are the communities that today you would say are practicing abolition, that are modeling what it looks like to think about liberation and freedom? And I know Ghani's coming, and he'll
I feel like, I mean, I wish Ghani were here, right? Because he's living, I mean, there's so many people doing wonderful work in Philadelphia around restorative practices, and I feel like you're better positioned to answer that question than me. I mean, you've got this community has its fingers in a lot of these efforts, no?
Definitely.
Why don't you, tell me about all the stuff that you all are doing.
Yeah, I think that we are definitely working with and moving with communities that are modeling an ethos of abolition and what it means to be together. And I think when I think of the prison system, one thing I think is a system of exile, of separating communities, of separating families, of picking people out of community and expecting that they can do teshuvah in a vacuum, which we know from our own practice that that's not possible. Teshuvah's in relationship. And so I see abolitionist communities here are communities that are built on relationship, where that start the day in a circle and end the day in a circle, and where people are constantly talking to one another, supporting one another, and there's this ethic of mutual care and compassion that's just the DNA of the community. So I'm thinking of a place called Emmaus House that we work with, of Exodus, places that look to to just foster relationship and have just a common understanding of what it means to be human as constantly evolving and also capable and in need of giving and receiving care. I see that playing out. Is that, what are the kind of abolitionist practices that you see? I know Ghani's, but from where you sit, how does that look?
You know, I feel like I do my own, like, my little, like, integrationist, like, talented 10th thing that's, like, barely abolitionist, right? Like, I do, you know, wow, here's this institution I'm a part of, and it's resource rich in this particular area, and there's this kind of, like, and foundations are funding this work right now, like, let's push it and see how far we can get. I don't even know if it counts as abolitionist, right? It might well be that, you know, in the abolitionist future, there's no University of Rochester, but you know, that's, you know, I think we all do our small pieces. Like, I really love your description of, like, starting the day and ending the day in circle, right? So I'm such a fraud for doing this because Ghani is an actual practitioner. But just in case anyone on the call is hearing this category, restorative practices or restorative justice for the first time, just as a little primer, right? The system we have, nominally, it's about the harm, but the system we have is set up entirely around the person seen as the agent of the harm. And affecting justice is taking the agent of the harm and putting them in a cage. And sometimes in, like, extreme cases, we're willing to say, oh, that's healing for the victim, like that brings closure or something of the sort. But it's really it's a thin justification. And those who are engaged in practices of restorative justice or transformative justice, and these are happening both within and proximate to the criminal justice system, but also independent of the criminal justice system, are drawing on indigenous practices, sometimes drawing on biblical notions, are trying to really center the person who has been hurt, or to center the harm, and rather than to have an adversarial system, people versus whoever, throw the person away, try to stage some kind of ritual of reconciliation where can try to heal the hurt, figure out from the person who has been hurt what it is they need, and to try to engender accountability on the part of the person who is responsible for the harm. Always in a collective setting rather than a setting of, there's a really wonderful abolitionist article called Conflicts as Property that makes a Weberian argument that, like, essentially we've been alienated from our conflicts. There's a class of experts who, like, do our conflicts for us. And so the spirit of abolitionism, it might sound fiery and scary. It actually, in so many ways, it's the spirit of, like, American lowercase r republicanism. Like, let's do it ourselves, people. We can do it better. And so all over the country, you have communities who if you're, again, I'm not the person to make this argument. I'm ventriloquizing others who should be making it. But this is according to people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mariam Kaba. If you talk to, let's say, a woman who's a victim of intimate partner violence, most of the time she doesn't want her partner to go to jail. That's not primarily what she wants and needs. She needs other things, right? And so in communities across the country where certain kinds of violence are endemic, people are trying to take the conflict back, not surrender it to the criminal justice system and be satisfied with the version of justice where putting a person in a cage is justice, but rather staging these kinds of rituals. And it's really hard, and, like, if you read the literature, they're all pointing to a few small cases, so I don't know how, another part of the abolitionist ethos is experimentation and failure. Like, we'll try a lot of things. But that's the notion. That's the notion of restorative or transformative justice. And when Rabbi Hillel talks about sitting in circle, she's gesturing to how those kinds of practices of mediation can become embedded in like the day-to-day and become a kind of the ground where community takes place.
I'm also not the person to make this argument, but I do think that common justice in New York, in the city, is kind of this beautiful model of an abolitionist community, and that's Danielle Serret, who's the founder, and she has a beautiful line in her book, How We Reckon, where she talks that the restorative justice practices are victim-centered, and it's really kind of a recognition that most of the time someone's going to come back to community, they're going to come home from prison. How do you want them showing up in community? How do you want them to come home? And this idea that we can actually do healing here, that we can have this kind of redemption and that kind of process within community, and instead of sending someone for, sit on Rikers Island for 2 years and then come back. So, question?
So, excuse me. Thanks for being here. To the extent that you acknowledge that there is a proper place for punishment or a system of punishment, could you speak to what you think are the purposes, the legitimate purposes of punishment? I think our system generally thinks of, rehabilitation, retribution, incapacitation, and deterrence. And you can talk about those. You can talk about others. You can discredit all of them, I suppose. But what do you see as that? Relatedly, what do you make of, retribution? There's sort of deep psychological, I dare say even religious roots to that. What do you make of that if we're talking about sort of the link between religion and abolition? There's certainly a link between religion and punishment you acknowledged earlier. And then, sorry to add another question to the mix. It may be true that, say, the victim of intimate, partner violence, some would say that they don't want their partners to go to jail. Others might say the opposite, that they do want their partner to go to jail, whether for reasons of retribution or incapacitation. And relatedly, many victims say, my loved one, is not here anymore. I want the person who was responsible for that to, suffer and spend the rest of their life in jail. What do you say to that person? How do you balance those two? If you're designing a system, to what extent at all do we give credit to the views of victims in those respects, in either respect?
Right. I mean, this is part of why I wasn't the person to make that argument. But I would try to this. I'm grateful for the burden of explanation and responsibility you put on my shoulders, and I will try to slough it off and give it to those who would defend the existing system that we have. Right. So as an historical matter, it's the case that and this goes back to the shift from Philly to Auburn. The question, what prisons are for, has been a moving target the entire time. Right. That as long as we've had prisons, they've never worked for the thing that they were supposed to do. Right. Something that's interesting is that of those justifications that you named, during the era of mass incarceration and massive prison expansion, it's really been justified by means of the least philosophically ambitious one, which is incapacitation, right? So as a philosophical matter, that's kind of how we justify it. The public safety depends on a certain number of people being in cages. So in trying, and Ghani is here, and you've heard enough from me, so I'm excited for Ghani to come to the table. But what I would do in trying to shift the burden is simply this. Forget about punishment in the abstract. What would we want our prison system to do? I can think of three justifications, right? To engender accountability, to foster healing for those who've been harmed, and to help us effect public safety. And the abolitionist stance, right, is that if we're really serious about any of those things, accountability, healing harms, or public safety, then we would not lean on prisons to try to affect them. That prisons are actually really bad at all of those things, right? When you think, certainly accountability, the incentives run counter to confession. Healing is beside the point. And public safety, yes, if you're thinking about the abstracted criminal. Public safety, no, if you're thinking about processes of criminalization and communities in need. Welcome, my friend.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much. Today was a clear demonstration of one aspect of prison, or at least long-term imprisonment, that doesn't get enough attention, and that is the infantilization effect of prison, how it infantilizes us. You know, I served 30 years, you know, from the age of 15 to 45. And I'm telling you, when we step out of there after decades in prison, coming out into a world that's nothing like what we left, you know, we really feel terribly insecure. You know what I'm saying? And I felt that today, having to depend on the navigation to get here. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges with making a transition back into society, is navigating this, negotiating the technology, right? And Siri just, I guess that's her name, she just had me going in circles, waiting until the last minute to tell me to stay this way and that way. And the only thing I saw was my ETA just expanding and expanding and expanding. And I felt the infantilization effect, and how prison turns us into infants where we can't even, you know, not in terms of our maturity. You know, we can go on to become very mature and disciplined in prison, become much better at making decisions, but just navigating the world as it is now. You know, when I went to prison in 1987, there were still phone booths on the corners. You know, if you had a car phone the size of a shoe, you were boss status, you know. But now I see everybody walking around with phones on their wrists. That used to be Dick Tracy. You know, that was the future. You know, for me, that's now, and it's really difficult. So that's one aspect of prison that doesn't get enough attention. You know, I don't know what grounds you covered so far, Josh.
I think we could really use some help with abolitionist practice, thinking about day-to-day local in a kind of global thinking, like acting locally and thinking globally, and restoration, reconciliation, those kind of things.
Yes. Let me say, and I don't know how, you know, I could imagine you, Josh, especially in a time that has gone by already in this discussion, you probably took a deep dive into abolition and explained that abolition is not destructive, it's generative, right? And it's not just about tearing anything down, closing prisons or anything like that. It's about what kind of society we want to build. Because if we were to close prisons right now, the effects of it would be still felt for generations, because the most pernicious effects of long-term imprisonment or mass human caging could be seen in the struggles of children of incarcerated or imprisoned parents. You know, 10 million of them are out there who are 7 times or 85% more likely to end up in prison themselves. If no positive intervention is made in their lives, they're 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, school phobias, the whole nine. And so the intergenerational effects of mass human caging is already in full effect. So even if we were to close all prisons now, you know, the work, the real work of healing, you know, that's when that would have to begin. And so abolition, any conversation about abolition has to be accompanied with a conversation about healing, right? Restoration. I'm personally right now in a program manager of a restorative justice diversion program called Healing Futures. And what that entails is, some of y'all might have heard about restorative justice diversion. Matter of fact, y'all have Common Justice here in Brooklyn. You know, one of my heroes, Daniel Sered, you know, her book Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair, I think is one of the pillars of books about mass human caging, along with Break Every Yoke. Yeah, I got that up there, right up there with New Jim Crow and just mercy, and all that. Break every yoke. I brought my book for you to sign it too. But no, what we do, the district attorney's office refers cases to us of young people who were apprehended for a variety of offenses, and we reach out to them, get them to enroll if they want to enroll, and then we work over the course of weeks to bring them face to face with the person that they've harmed, and at something called a Restorative Community Conference, or RCC. Conference might make it sound big, but it's very intimate. It's the responsible youth, which is what we call them. We don't call them young offenders. And the person harmed, or survivor, which is what we call them. We don't call them victims. And their family members or supporters, and also community members, people who were not directly impacted by the harm, but have a vested interest in the health and well-being of the community. And we circle up in a very intimate circle, and we give the responsible youth and the person harmed an opportunity to face each other. The person harmed gives an impact statement about how the harm impacted them in their life. The young person gets an opportunity to offer an accountability statement or an apology that they were working on over the course of the weeks in the program. And everybody there gets a chance to weigh in, to express how they were impacted indirectly or whatever by the harm, but also what hopes they have for in this young person. And then we come up with a restorative plan for the young person of how they're going to repair the harm that they caused. It could be anything. For instance, one example was the person harmed, she faced this young man who had assaulted her on a train station. And she told him that she wanted him to volunteer for 4 hours a week at an organization that helps people to heal from violence, or victims advocacy organization. She wanted him to volunteer for 4 hours a week for 6 months. She wanted him to receive therapy. She wanted him to get a job, right? And then he volunteered on his own to take his first 2 pay periods, right, to give to her to help her with utilities and so on and so forth. And then we had a community agreement on that. And then he or they work on their restorative plan, whatever it is, over the course of 2 to 7 months. When they complete it, we let the district attorney's office know that they've completed the program, and then no charges are filed. No criminal record is entered. Probation and jail time is not on the table anymore. And it's as if the charge never occurred. Then we have a celebration. We have a community celebration for every case. Not celebrating that some young person got off softly for harm that they've done, but celebrating what we as a community have the capacity to do when we circle our wagons around our young people and around our people who are harmed, right? We celebrate our ability, our collective ability to work through our differences, resolve conflict, and heal from harm, right? Even after we've trespassed again, to work out our own trespasses against each other without handcuffs and cages. We celebrate our own agency. And that's the piece about abolition and restorative justice and transformative justice, right? Healing justice is the agency piece, because that's what we lack in the current model that we've been confined to. When a harm happens, we go into this building, right, that's supposed to be a monument that houses justice, right? And let me just say, that's what we're in the process of doing too. Abolition is about liberating justice, liberating the very concept of justice. That's what Break Every Yoke is doing, because the concept of justice is being held hostages in these buildings, right? And people have to go to these buildings to get justice rationed out to them, when we trespass against each other. And when a harm happens, we go into these buildings. The person harmed sits on one side with their family. The responsible youth sits on another side with their family. Everyone has to remain silent. No one has a voice, can say anything. There is literally a partition separating them from the goings-on that concerns them. And only two people has a voice, mainly the defense and the prosecutor, arguing for and against both sides. And someone sits literally at a higher altitude than everyone else and judges. And the only utility value that anyone's voice has in there is when they're called on to walk up and testify. Once they testify, their utility value is done and they're dispensed with. Once the case is, whatever the result, whether the case is won or lost, everyone is dispensed with, dispersed, and no one is checked up on afterwards to see how they're recovering from the traumas of the harm, how they're healing, and all of this is done in the name of justice. And so our process, a restorative process, which is, restorative justice is just a term that we came up with in the 70s for the way people all over the world have been living for millennia, right? All over the world, the way we've been addressing harm, right? In our process, we sit in a circle, we face each other. No one is sitting higher than anyone else. No one is judging, right? And everyone has a voice. Everyone has a say in how they were impacted and how they want this outcome to look like, right? And that's the difference between a carceral outcome and a restorative outcome, right? That's the abolitionist vision, right? The abolitionist vision is building a different model of justice, like R. Buckminster Fuller would say, and he was the architect of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Remember when he said, you don't change things by fighting the existing reality. In order to change something, build a new model that renders the existing model obsolete, right? And that's a part of abolition too, the prefigurative politics of it, right? Prefiguring the kind of world that we want to see. And that's what we're doing with Healing Futures. And so far, we've had a few young people complete their programs. We have some people, maybe about 6 cases right now, young people who have enrolled. We're going to have a community celebration for one. We had to cancel it on Sunday because it was rained out, and so we're rescheduling it. And another piece is, and I know my thoughts are a little discursive here. I'm trying to stay centered in light of how the day went. But the role that nature has to play in this, I just want to lift this up. Nature is, in my view, nature has to be a character in the justice process. Not just a backdrop, not just seeing nature itself. I'm talking about the natural world has to be a character in the justice process. Kind of like with the Gacaca courts with post-genocide Rwanda, right? Gacaca literally means justice in the grass, in the grass, Nature itself, there is healing power, like Rachel Carson said. Those who contemplate the beauties of nature find reserves of strength that endure as long as life lasts. There is infinite healing power in the repeated refrains of nature, the assurance that winter follows the spring, or spring follows the winter, and day follows the night, and things like that. And so we've incorporated nature. We got connected with a horse farm in Media, Pennsylvania, where we take young people out to the farms to interact with the horses, because we saw that it's important to get them out of these concrete jungles, these socially toxic environments that were not biologically evolved to live in. On the clock of human evolution, living stacked up on top of each other like this and crammed in these concrete built environments this way is a scenario that really developed in the last microsecond. And we're expected to adjust to this. Our children is expected to adjust to this, and it's not natural. We are used to being around trees and water and hearing birds and, and crickets at night. and seeing fireflies and things like that, and so, we found that having the children go out onto the farm and interact with the animals, one restorative plan, by the way, and I saw you grab the mic, Rabbi Hilly, and I know we're on the clock. I got to take into account, I just walked in here at the tail end of things. This is not the beginning of the event. One restorative plan was for one young person who was responsible for an assault on another young person to help two horses that couldn't get along to get along, And that was particularly meaningful, to say the least, transformative. It was transformative for the young person, because now that young person has chosen a spiritual path. And she was 14 years old, and so, yeah, I just want to lift that up about abolition. Abolition is not just about destroying things. That's not the image or the vision that the abolitionists, that's not what you paint in Break Every Yoke. In Break Every Yoke, you're painting something on the horizon, the abolitionist horizon of a better world, right? And that's what restorative justice is about. I don't know if that was that relevant to the question?
Definitely.
Because I was all over the place.
Oh no, and you're also giving us a definition of abolition that we hadn't named before, which is one that names overlapping systems of injustice. And so when we talk about mass incarceration, we also have to talk about the ways that environmental injustice overlaps with those systems. So look at Rikers Island. That's a local undesirable land use. That's a toxic site on which we've built a jail.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about undoing that, naming it, and then reimagining the opposite of flourishing and ecological flourishing and human flourishing happening in one place. And that's the abolitionist vision that undoes what's happening on Rikers Island.
That's right.
And many prisons, as I learned this from you, are built on toxic sites.
That's right.
And become toxic aspects of ecosystems.
That's right. The prison industrial complex is one of the most damaging institutions or industries to surrounding ecosystems. One of the criteria for prison site selection, right? And that's something we don't discuss too much about, this thing called site selection. Why are certain areas chosen to build prisons on? Why are those areas always barren? Why are those areas always far away, right? With almost away from any kind of civilization. A lot of times it's because those areas or that land base was already destroyed by previous industries, be it coal, steel, or whatever. Fayette County, the industry that they built that prison SCI Fayette on was previously a toxic ash dump. That was the industry there. And they literally built a prison on top of that. And so these land bases are dead, they're destroyed, they're useless, and so they're cheap real estate. They're really, really cheap, and so they're appealing to the prison industrialists, But what happens is you're building a prison that's going to house a couple of thousand people apiece on toxic land. And so you're really erecting a toxic death chamber. In Fayette, for instance, population, there's been an outbreak of gastrointestinal issues, cancers, tumors, cysts, rashes, all kind of issues in that area because of the toxic ash dump. But the deep part about it is the surrounding areas too, because this is a rural community. The surrounding areas, there's a higher rates of cancer in that area, in the Luzerne County area in Pennsylvania. So let's lift that up too. Even though maybe 70% of the people that's in those prisons, are people who would say people of color, 70% of all prisons are built in rural areas that are predominantly white. And so we can't afford to be divided on this issue. We can't afford to see this as, just a black and white issue, Mass human caging is impacting all of us. This is not it's just them in there that's in the physical confines of the prison, because those prisons are deleterious to the health of the surrounding communities, which are a lot of times predominantly white. And so until we see how prisons are not just about what it does to the 2.6 million people actually in the physical confines, but what it does to the rest of the 330 million of us, right? Until we see ourselves as impacted by mass human caging, whether because of its destructive effects on the surrounding ecosystem, but just about its destructive effects on our morality. When we learn to live and make peace alongside these monuments of misery, right, in the name of justice, when we numb ourselves like that, what are we becoming, over time? And so yeah, there is that piece as well.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on, only because I think the soundtrack of the month of Elul and our high holidays is the call of the shofar, and it's a call that is meant to wake us up. And I think that you have just articulated something that is so powerful, that for us to think about, what have we become numb to? How have we treated the people around us? How do we treat one another? And how do we need to wake up to the injustices that we have become numb to? I think that's beautiful. And if there's anything else, anyone else wants to end with a shofar call to wake us up, to prepare us. I also love to, I'm taking away the ritual you described, that we are embarking on this moment of communal and individual ritual, of this transformational ritual around reconciliation and atonement, and to see how powerful it is in the ways that you just described. I'm now thinking about how I can take more seriously my own teshuvah, and the ways that can be transformative in my life and the way I move in the world. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And Rabbi Haber, that's the important piece to me. And I probably just ran down a laundry list of issues and problems and concerns about mass human caging. But there is that piece that gives us hope, and that is, concepts like teshuvah. We need to retreat to these concepts, and these principles. Therein lies our salvation, and our rescue from these things that we're dealing with right now. Exploration, a deeper exploration of the role of Geula. Is that the proper pronunciation? Right, in these times, that redemption, deliverance, and redemption being something that's connected to community, right? Because, you have some people that might say, okay, well, they can sit in a prison cell and be redeemed, but redemption is a communal thing, There is no redemption without the community accepting your transformation. You know what I'm saying? And then what does that mean? And so, I think what resonates with me is the prayer that was given to me by a friend that I made the last time I was here, when Rabbi Angela Bukdal invited me here. And you moderated that discussion too. It was a beautiful panel discussion. But I didn't know there was someone in the audience who would become my friend. His name is Kevin Lando, and he gave me this prayer. And I think I remember it still, but it says it's the redemption prayer. I don't know the Hebraic way to say it, but the English translation is, remember the day you witnessed the impossible. You once lived in chains, your feet sunk in mortar and mud. Then one day, a strong hand gripped yours and pulled you free. You once lived in a prison house, married to your master, afraid at every turn. And then one night, a fire ignited inside you, leading the way out. You once lived in a land without choices. And you carried all you owned and ran to the water's edge. And the waters parted, and your feet found dry land. You once lay bound in a knot of grief, tied tight to a person who could never return, chained to a cloud. And then one day, the cloud moved behind you, and you turned and faced the wind. You thought it could never happen, that nothing would ever change. But one day, today, you held your breath and decided to leap forward. And waters rose on your right and on your left. I think that's it. We were redeemed from slavery, and we are grateful for this opportunity to be free. Help us now to embrace our responsibility to redeem others. Inspire us to do our parts in creating a world that is filled with truth, dignity, and justice. Whew. I think it was some parts I was forgetting there.
I think so. I have to say,
But
we read that every Saturday morning for bar mitzvahs for like 7 years, and I never heard that prayer like the way you just said. Yeah. It was transformed. Did you know that that's actually Dara Horn? She's a novelist who actually took pieces from our Bible and from our liturgy and kind of put it together to that beautiful thing, but it never spoke to me the way it just like.
yeah, what's deep about that prayer is that you can hear everybody in there. You were chained, whether it's talking about somebody dealing with some kind of enslavement or oppression. You were in a prison house, an incarcerated person. You were in a strange land, in a place without choices, and you took all you own, and you ran for the water's edge. I'm thinking about somebody that might be fleeing their country that we labeled immigrant or refugee today. You know what I'm saying? Undocumented person, And you lay bound in a knot of grief, tied tight to a person who could never return, someone who lost someone to violence today, And there's so many people out there grieving the loss of some loved one that was taken by senseless violence, And then all of us at the end, it's talking about all of us. So redemption is not just this thing that's just for those behind the walls or people who have done wrong. Redemption is for all of us. We all in this society, have to be redeemed. Whether by commission or omission, of something. Whether we committed an act of harm or we stood by, and didn't do anything, right? And so that prayer for me is, it just seared itself into my memory, Redemption is a very important part of abolition, because that's what abolition was about redeeming the humanity in people, in human beings. And for me, that's what redemption is. Redemption is about becoming more than what prison what I was put in prison for. I know I did wrong, and I'm not entitled to be out here. I will never live down the harm that I caused, because it's irreparable and irreversible. That's why it's so personally meaningful to me to be able to be involved in a program like Healing Futures, where I'm helping young people to embrace their accountability, which is something that the system doesn't do. The system is not about helping us to explore accountability. Accountability is not sitting in a prison cell vegetating, generating millions and billions of dollars for corporations and industries. Accountability is when that person who've done wrong, whatever wrong they've done, especially if they've committed the ultimate trespass, the taking of a human life, like I was responsible for, right? Accountability requires agency on the part of that person. That person, they're an awakening of an ownership of what they've done, and then them wanting to get their hands on making things right, or as best as they can, bringing balance back into the lives and the communities that they've left imbalanced by their act. Right? Accountability is when a person who's done wrong wants to grab an oar, wants to grab their oar and help steer the ship from going over the waterfall. You know what I mean? That's accountability. There's a language that the system uses. Well, we're going to hold this person accountable. We can't hold anybody accountable. There is no holding. We can support someone in being accountable. Accountability has to rise out of the person. You can't hold someone accountable. You can put someone in a prison cell, and they don't have to be remorseful. They don't have to be apologetic. They're just passive recipients of punishment. That's not accountability. Accountability is when there is a birth of responsibility inside of the person, and they exercise their agency to want to make change. And that's the connection between accountability and redemption. That's redemption, right? That's teshuvah. That's atonement. You can't hold somebody to atonement. Atonement has to arise from within the person. And that's what restorative justice, transformative justice, abolition, all of those things are interconnected. That's what that's all about.
I want to thank you both so much for coming here tonight, for having this conversation. I've been thinking about what you said 3 years ago here for the last 3 years, so I know for the next 3 years, and hopefully it's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing your story, sharing your work. Thank you for teaching us throughout the month of Elul and for putting together this conversation. And thank you all for being here and for leading us. Yeah, please.
I just feel very moved to do this. I didn't plan to take them. I just have to say that it is really, truly a privilege to have these giants. I think we feel this, but I'm just like, I'm feeling very heartful to be able to have these giants of this work, really to have probably the most brilliant academic doing this work right now in the country, who also brings a depth of Jewish knowledge behind it, which is so powerful. To have, I think, the most powerful rabbi in this work, who is such a spiritual leader, and part of the way we know that is she's brought people who never thought this was their issue to follow her lead, to be in the work, to get proximate, and to really understand it in such a deep way. And then to have, I think, really kind of the prophet of abolitionism and restorative justice in our midst. I really, honestly, Ghani, every time you talk, I feel like I'm in the presence of a modern prophet. And that is just the feeling I have every time I'm in your presence. But when you speak, God has given you this gift, and it is like reason enough for us to know that we have to change the system. I felt that when I heard you, when you have the privilege of hearing you in front of our community, but really every time, and it's just such a privilege. Josh introduced you to us, and that's always a gift. And anyway, I couldn't leave tonight without thanking you and saying what it really feels like a true privilege that this is something we got to put into the atmosphere, and for me to have heard this, and for our community to have heard it tonight, and all of you who are watching. So thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thanks.